amazing Australians and the story of their lives. You're tuned to Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald.
Hello and welcome, listeners. My guest today is Professor Peter Roennfeldt, musician, historian and presenter. Professor Roennfeldt's primary focus is music, not just performance, but also the understanding of its social impact through research into the context of the who, how and when. For more than 4 decades, his specialist knowledge of Queensland's musical heritage has been widely disseminated in numerous books, articles, radio broadcasts and public lectures. He holds degrees in music from the Universities of Queensland and Adelaide and a doctorate from the University of Cincinnati. For more than 3 decades, he was on the academic staff of Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University, including 7-year tenure as its director. His involvement with the Conservatorium and its research centre continues in an honorary capacity as Professor Emeritus. As a performer, Peter is active as a pianist in vocal and instrumental chamber music and as a harpsichordist, conductor in Baroque opera and choral music. His primary area of interest for more than 4 decades has been Queensland cultural heritage, and he is the author of 5 books on local history. Welcome, Peter.
Hello.
Peter, now I'm sure our listeners would like to find out a little bit more about your early life, where you came from and where you grew up.
Okay. Well, I'm a Queenslander. At the time I was born, my family was living in North Queensland in Mackay.
All right.
But I can only claim to have lived there for 1 month because we moved very soon after I was born. And so most of my life was spent in southeast Queensland, first on the Toowoomba Range in Highfields, then in Lowood, a small town further south, going towards Ipswich, where we then moved in the late 60s. My family was there for 20 years, so I did a good part of my schooling and commuted to the University of Queensland for 4 years from Ipswich.
And when did your interest and love of music start?
Well, I come from a generally musical family. My father was a Lutheran minister, so music was in the house, and we went to church regularly, and music was always part of that tradition. And I had sisters who played the piano and sang. I had an aunt who was a professional musician, music teacher, and a grandmother who I believe could have pursued music had circumstances be different. She came from Germany after the First World War. So there was music in my mother's side of the family very strongly, but I had to beg to have lessons. They didn't think I was serious. So after many years of nagging, they gave in and I started piano lessons when I was about 10 years old.
Oh, right. And soon realised that something you were really good at.
Yes, and I think it was just the enjoyment of exploring. And I mean, you go with your first interest. In my case, it was the piano, and then that gives you a way into all sorts of other types of music as well, even music you might never perform on that instrument.
Now, you served as professor at the Griffith University's Queensland Conservation of Music from 1986 to 2017, so perhaps just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, well, I was away from Brisbane for 7 years doing postgraduate studies. And when I came back from America at the end of 1985, I didn't really think I would stay in Brisbane. But I knocked on the door of the director of the Queensland Conservatorium and he said, oh, well, you could play for a choir. And then that led to being involved in an opera production in a few months after I started, and then a bit of teaching, and then one thing led to another, as they say. And then within about 18 months, I was full-time. And then stayed on, and then the big amalgamation process with Griffith University happened 4 or 5 years after that. And I guess when I put my hand up to become a deputy director, our new director was saying he'd like to revitalise the management team, so I said yes. And at the point I was about to say, thank you, that enough is enough, he took leave. And then eventually I was acting director for a few months, so the Vice-Chancellor top, just a few months, which became 7 years. And then at the end of that, I set a new precedent. Most previous directors had either retired or gone on to another position, but I decided to stay on the teaching staff after I was my director time had finished. So I continued there until the beginning of 2018. That's when I retired from teaching.
And you were president with the National Council of Tertiary Music Schools and the Australian National Choral Association.
Yes, that's a case of walking into an annual general meeting and walking out as the president. You often wonder how that actually happened. With the National Council of Tertiary Music Schools, that was a body set up in the late 90s to, I guess, build a bit of a lobbying power with government and policymakers. And I had been attending those meetings as director of the conservatorium, and every few years, the elections for a new executive came up, and someone literally tapped me on and said, "Oh, can I nominate you?" And I said, "Oh, okay." And then I became head of that for, I think that was for 5 years. And I'd always been involved with choirs since my early years, of course, being involved with church music, that was a natural outlet, also at school.
Right.
And then at university, so choirs were my second love. And I was involved with the Australian National Choral Association. And another case, there was a special general meeting called on certain issues of concern at the time, and the decision was made to appoint an interim executive to oversee our transition. Once again, literally tapped on the shoulder, "Can I nominate you?" And then I became president of that for 5 years. It was probably a little bit more, actually. And I suppose I'm the sort of person who likes to have things organised well, and I really get frustrated when I can see something being done not as well as I could have done it had I been with a bit more control and a bit more ability to have input. So I tend to be on committees with an active role rather than just a passive role. But having done enough of that, I'm not so keen to be on any more committees now.
I'm not surprised at all. Now, look, music means a lot to our listeners, many of whom, of course, are sight impaired. But you don't need sight to appreciate music, do you?
No, absolutely not. And there's a long tradition of blind musicians right across millennia. And some of the finest pianists, organists, singers we know.
Andre Bocelli.
Yeah, that's right.
Absolutely comes to mind. Ray Harris and Stevie Wonder.
That's right.
Yep.
And some composers went blind in their later life, like J.S. Bach, he was one.
Yes.
And so it doesn't stop you at all. And actually, in working with a few blind singers, as I have done, you can tell their oral memory is so acute, their oral perception is so acute, because I believe when you have limited or no ability in one sensory area, the other senses expand to take over and fill in that gap. So with music, you may not be able to see the notes on the page, but your perception of the sound and how sound works is so much clearer in your mind because all your energy goes on the sound.
Exactly. I think you'd be able to confirm that, Paul, wouldn't you? Our producer there.
Certainly can, and I sang with the choir back in 1997 through the con.
Oh, yes.
Can't remember the director's name, John
Nixon, yes.
John Nixon,
yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We did a little concert, I think it was towards the end of 97.
Yes, okay, I remember that, yes.
You're there.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And I've worked with, and I've been involved in a small way with some choirs around town. And, one of my singers, Julianne van der Boer,
Julianne Bell.
I forget her married name.
Bell.
Oh, Julianne Bell, of course.
Went to school
yes, I worked with
Julianne
her
Bell.
for a number of years very intensively.
Yep.
And, you just had to give her a little bit of notice to prepare the music.
Right.
And then she came prepared with her Braille copies.
Yes.
And she was incredibly quick at, now we'll go from this spot, and she would find it really quickly. So, and also came extremely well prepared. And so it was really good for me to work with someone like that because you could see that their skills are so sharpened and focused.
Yes, absolutely. And a couple of weeks ago, we interviewed Rachel Leokar because there were the Australian Blind Awards of the year.
Oh, okay.
And
yes.
Rachel came and sang to us. Now, she was on The Voice, runner-up on The Voice, and she is very sight impaired.
Yeah, sure.
But the most beautiful singing voice. And, of course, as I mentioned before, Andre Bocelli.
Yes.
And his music is just something, out of this world, really, isn't it? Now, you've performed as a pianist, a harpsichordist and choral conductor for over 40 years, haven't you? So it's been quite a while.
Yes, and you keep asking how long you'll go on for, but then ideas come to you for different programs. I'm just in the process of planning a few programs for early next year. This year seemed to start busy and remain busy. My first concert was at the end of February with my regular ensemble of 4 singers and me on the piano. And then I had an Easter concert with a different group, some string players and a different set of singers. And then I went away on a trip in June, but then I was already planning a concert for August, and then something came up in September, and then another big concert in October. So the year just flew past because you go from one project to the next.
Of course, yes. You've done so much research into the history of music in Queensland. We will discuss your books a little bit later, but the history of it all is very important to you, isn't it?
Yes. Actually, when I was thinking about what to do after school, I applied for the University of Queensland, and I knew if I didn't get to do music or that didn't work out, history would be my other pursuit that I would follow. As it happens, I got into the music degree, but interestingly, at the time, the degree required us to leave the building and take a non-music subject, one non-music subject for each semester in the first 2 years. And I kept going with that. So within my 4-year degree, I ended up with the equivalent of an arts major in history. So I did a mixture of European and Australian history subjects. And then when it came time for my honours dissertation, it was a really interesting gift that set me up. My supervisor said, this musician worked in Brisbane for 40 years. He died in 1959. Very influential, quite significant person in many respects. He needs his biography written now because its time has passed.
Yes.
So, I'll take that on. And the excitement of doing primary research was something I don't think I was really prepared for that. This person's private collection of books and scores and other things mostly went down to the University of Sydney Library. So I had to spend 2 weeks researching there in the semester break. Some items were held here in Queensland, but I had to go to Sydney for the bulk of the research. Well, go through the personal papers, which were the end of my 2 weeks. I was going through his personal papers, correspondence, and there I was opening up a box with a letter from Joan Sutherland written back to my topic, Robert Dudley Scarlett, thanking him for the introductions he had written for her when she went to England about 4 years earlier to famous conductors. And she writes in this letter to him, just a thank you letter.
Yes.
She said, and now it's coronation time and all of London is abuzz. So I was getting a report from Joan Sutherland of what it's like to be in London at the time of the coronation.
Oh, how wonderful.
And it was just like, and this was just a piece of paper with some personal writing on it.
Yes.
And that is just so exciting to come across a primary source like that from someone that's very famous.
Yes.
But it's just a little shred of history right there in front of you. And you think, wow, this stuff is alive. It exists.
Very special.
And it needs to be explored.
Yes, exactly. Very, very special to find something like that. You're listening to Lots to Chat About. I'm Rosemary Peterswald, and my guest today is Professor Peter Roennfeldt, musician, historian and presenter. You've contributed much to the wider understanding of Queensland's cultural heritage, and I think possibly the best way that our listeners can become part of this is to discuss each of your books that you have written. If you're happy to go through that, and we can discuss a little bit about each one. Now, the first one I came across, of course, was A Hall for All, celebrating University of Queensland's main hall. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Peter?
Well, that was my last book. That was my 6th book. It came out at the end of 2023, within the year, the 50th anniversary year of Main Hall opening in 1973. And for that, I was very fortunate to get the Lord Mayor's Helen Taylor Research Award for Local History, quite a significant prize. And so that assisted with funding towards the actual publication. UQ Press published it. And I remember Main Hall, that was our hall when I was at the university. It was still quite new when I started there in 1975. Concerts happened there. I was in a few, attended many. Graduations were there, public lectures were there, and then in later years schools used it a lot. And what I found interesting about that, of course the building is no longer a concert hall, it was converted into an art museum about 20 years ago. But I knew I wanted to interview people to verify the significance and the personal value a building like that has for people's life memories. And I had so many interesting interactions with people who graduated there. They experienced that moment in time which lives on so vividly in their memory. Certain moments in specific concert programs. I remember going to a graduation. It actually wasn't a UQ graduation. I was on the staff of the Conservatorium. One year, it was 1989, I think it was, we held our graduation at Main Hall. Maybe we needed it for the bigger size, I'm not sure.
Right.
So we went along, and the guest speaker was Gough Whitlam.
Oh,
of all
really?
people.
Oh, right, yeah.
And, of course, he'd been to Main Hall for other reasons earlier on, when he, either before or after he was Prime Minister. And he said something interesting, which I've never seen documented anywhere else, but I remembered it because I was there. Right. He said, you all artistic musical people should remember that the environment movement got its energy up and politics took notice when they realised there were votes in the environment issue.
Oh, of course.
And he said, you should realise, or you should be emboldened to believe that there are votes in the arts. Right. And I just remember that it was such a synthesised short statement, and it meant so much.
Yes.
You know, there are votes in the arts. Now, that never got into the reviews in the paper of that event. I was there, I remembered it, so it went into my book as my personal memory. But there were other memories by other people, and I keep finding this, when I do local history, many of my topics involve living memory. And I find with people, when I study buildings, people may not remember what the piece being played was, or may not remember who was speaking, or they might remember what was said, like I just did, but they always remember where they were. So it's this sense of place.
Exactly.
And that is, to me, such a deep, profound memory. You remember the colours, you remember the sights, you remember the lighting, you remember everything. You remember the situation you were in. And so I've been able to capture some of that in this history, because histories of buildings can be a little bit dull. You know, they can be... not that architectural history is at all dull, but I mean, writing about a building, it has to come to life through the experience of the people who used it.
Exactly.
And I found that was a wonderful project, because it captured all these memories which are still living on in people's minds.
Well, in so many people's minds, aren't they?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So many knew or know and knew that hall.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrific. So the next one that I came across, of course, is celebrating the first 100 years of Queensland Music Teachers Association.
Yes. Well, I've been a member of the Music Teachers Association basically since I came back to Brisbane, and I haven't been teaching privately for some time now, but I've always stayed a member, and I've given workshops, lectures, I've spoken at summer schools, winter schools. I've been involved. And I was at a conference, and I said, you know, your organisation, coming up to its 100th year anniversary, you need to have its history written. I guess I was volunteering to do it.
Fair enough.
But I could see, and with other history I'd written already by that point, some of the key musicians in Queensland, well, they were all members of this association. It was the peak body.
Yes.
Before we had a conservatorium, before we had a real strong music department at the University of Queensland, the peak body representing the profession as a whole, music, not just teaching, but music generally, was this body. And I thought, no, you have to celebrate the importance that founding this association, what it meant for music generally and for students, professionals, the wider community. So I wrote that institutional history, and it came out at the end of their centenary year in 2021. So that was a great experience. And once again, there I gleaned a lot from personal memory, but also celebrating all those founding pioneers who, I mean, we complain about lack of funding now, but they had even less funding there. And what they did just on their ingenuity and talent and fortitude, they made things happen.
Exactly.
And that was, and I wanted to have that documented.
And a wonderful documentation it is as well. And it all happened at Brisbane's Albert Hall.
Yes. Actually, I had a grand plan at one point thinking, well, wouldn't it be good to trace Albert Hall and Main Hall, because Albert Hall opened in 1901 and was closed and demolished in 1969. Main Hall opened in 1973 and then continued as a concert hall right through the end of the 20th century and just a bit beyond. So I thought in these two buildings we capture a lot of cross-section of Brisbane's cultural life. They were both, I guess, not the biggest concert hall in town, but the next biggest. But it was the building in each case that you could afford to hire, had adequate seating. In the case of Albert Hall, which used to be next to the Albert Street Methodist Church, it was very central. So easy to get to, good acoustics. And I had come across Albert Hall in the careers of other musicians, and when the Conservatorium opened in 1957, that was the hall they could use for graduations and special concerts, because it was, 700 seats. It was quite substantial. That was the hall where all the local theatre companies put on their major seasons. 3, 4, 5 theatre companies in the 50s and 60s, they all had their plays there. Before we had the SGIO Theatre, for instance, or their own venues. So I thought that building needs to be celebrated. And once again, living oral history was part of it. But I went back to 1901. So it's about a building for sure, but it's about a cross-section of cultural life in Brisbane. And the sorts of things, I mean, you could hire it for anything. You could hire it for meetings, protest meetings, public meetings. The CWA was formed in a meeting held at Albert Hall. There were campaign launches there for political figures. Conferences were held there. One of the scientific organisations presented its major medal to Mawson, the Antarctic explorer. They had their conference every so often, and when it was held in Brisbane in the early 30s, Mawson was there to receive his prize.
Incredible.
Famous people and famous musicians performed there and all sorts. I mean, it was quite a snapshot of everything going on in town. That's why I called it All Happened. Like, if something was on, if it wasn't at the City Hall, it probably happened at Albert Hall.
At the Albert Hall.
Yeah.
Oh, how wonderful.
So that was a lovely project,
And a terrific thing for everybody to have, to be able to read that.
That's right, yes.
Now, of course, your next one was about an inspiring musician and her legacy for Queensland.
Yes. Madame Mallieu, I had come across her, and actually that was an interesting story about one thing leading to another. When I was writing the conservatorium history, I had a little section on Mallieu Home, which was known as a hostel for female students where they could stay, run by the CWA. And I thought, okay, I'll put that in there as a little section. And we all thought that the building had been demolished in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And just as I was going to print with the conservatorium history, someone contacted me and said, oh, you might know, someone's trying to look into the history of their house. It used to be in Toowong. And two and two together, we realised this was the former hostel. Now, the story about that was that Madame Mallieu, a famous musician, came here in 1864 from England, built an amazing career. She performed until she was 80. She died at the age of 96. She was involved in women's politics as well for the franchise, but also women's social advancement in general. A major pianist, our first major female organist, a prominent figure in every field that she undertook. Well, her home was bequeathed after the final death of her own children.
Yes.
It was bequeathed to the CWA to set up a hostel to support the academic aspirations of young musicians. So I got involved in that story through the history of the house.
Right.
And then as I got into this, I thought I'd be writing just the history of the house. Then I found out through people knowing people that someone else, quite on her own bat, was doing her family history. So she contributed a good third of the book through her family history research, and then I put in the musical career. So Madame Mallieu, it's a three-part book. Her family history, both in England and Australia, her own career here and the amazing things she did as a musician, and then the last bit is about the house and what the house meant for 2 and 3 generations after her.
I can't wait to read it. I'm very lucky because Peter brought me a copy.
Yes.
Now, the Brisbane Chorale, our journey.
Yes, that one was, I was involved with the Brisbane Chorale virtually, as I said, from my first weeks back in Brisbane. The director said, we need someone to play for rehearsals. Can you come along? So I went along the next night. Played for concerts, played for rehearsals. When he left, I became their acting conductor, then 2 years in my own right, and I gave some big performances that I remember fondly through them. And then I moved into other areas, but I'd stayed in touch with the Brisbane Chorale in various ways. And they felt they wanted their history written, and I'd written the conservatorium history, which led me into that a fair bit. And so one thing led to another, and that got published, I think, in 2017. So that was the history of an organisation. But once again, it was not just about them, it was about how they interface with the rest of the musical community. So
some wonderful books, and at the end of our chat, I'll let people know how to get hold of those. But now, you've always had a long-standing fascination with Bach music. Please tell us more about your new harpsichord, an incredible instrument. And now, for our listeners who may not be able to see one, can you sort of actually explain what it looks like and how you play it?
Yes. Okay. Yes, Baroque music has been an interest of mine since childhood, and we mentioned J.S. Bach as the pinnacle of that period, but there's so many other composers.
Can I just interrupt? There was a blind harpsichordist, which Helmut Walker, W-A-L-C-H, the German, who had recordings of Bach's music, didn't he? Yes.
Oh, yes. And, in the period, this is before the piano was invented, the harpsichord, I guess you could connect it more closely to the guitar or the harp. The way the sound is made is a plucking, a plectrum, like a modern guitarist might use a plectrum,
right,
plucks the string. So it's a plink. Every note is a pluck. Whereas with the piano, a hammer strikes the string, so it's a percussive effect.
Right.
So that's the main difference.
Yes.
So with the harpsichord, it's a small keyboard, just 5 octaves.
Yes.
Sometimes you have 2. The one I own has just 1 keyboard, which is plenty for what I need to do with it.
Yeah.
It's an instrument where you might have 1 set of strings or 2 set of strings or maybe 3. I just have 2, so you could have a single sound or an alternative sound,
Right.
or you can join the 2 together with a mechanism.
Right.
So you have 2 strings sounding at once. So you have really 3 basic sounds, and there's a 4th sound where you can put a mute on, and it sounds a bit like, I don't know how to describe that one, but it's a muted sound, so it's a more muffled sound.
Right.
So basically 4
Sounds
sets of sound.
fascinating. Yeah.
So I have that at home, and I just got that 2 years ago. I did own another instrument many years ago, but I eventually got rid of that. It was not built in the way that they build harpsichords these
Right,
days with
yeah.
more historical principles.
Oh, okay.
So it's more like playing a harpsichord that might have felt and sounded like it did in the 18th century.
Oh, wonderful.
So I
Yeah.
feel very close to the music when I play that instrument.
Oh, and it sounds like an absolutely wonderful instrument. But now, through your chosen medium of the piano and other keyboard instruments, you're continually exploring lesser-known music written either by familiar composers or those who deserve wider recognition. We'd love to hear more about this, particularly some of the French Baroque composers from the time of Louis XIV.
Yes. Well, I've always my main background and heritage is German music, so that
Yep.
comes through my family and all those connections.
Yep.
But just the sound of French Baroque music, to me, there was always something special about it because it's quite different to Vivaldi and Bach and Handel. And when you listen to it, you can see them dancing very gracefully. The images of grace and elegance and grandeur and sophistication, it's all of that, just like the French language is a bit. Whereas Italian is very effusive and bright and brilliant,
Yes.
the French are much more understated and more sophisticated and perhaps a bit more, you have to get to know it. It induces you into wanting to know more. So it draws you in a way that other
Seduces
cultures,
you, yes.
Yeah. And so with French music, and I've always liked the sound of it. And one year I was putting on a concert. I said, it'd be good to do something by Charpentier, who was one composer always intrigued me when I heard him on the radio. And I went through the list of works and I found a piece, Les Plaisirs de Versailles, The Pleasures of Versailles. Well, that sounds good. I wonder what that is. Well, I programmed a concert with that title and hadn't got the music yet. So I had to, in those days, you sent a fax
Right.
to the Bibliothèque Nationale requesting a photocopy of this piece. And I thought, that'll go nowhere.
Yeah.
Well, in 6 weeks' time, the score arrived to me, facsimile, printed off, and then I transcribed the music from that facsimile, from
Yes.
what they held, the original manuscript. And I produced that work. So that was a case of, I think was the first performance in Australia. How else could it not be? Because no one had heard of this piece. And then it hadn't even been recorded yet. The first recording of this piece came out some years later. So I felt I was doing something a bit special and new.
And absolutely. Now, also, Peter, an aspect of your performances, of course, is the link between places, pieces, and people. And you frequently present concerts in heritage venues or with historic instruments. Now, where can people go and listen to you?
Okay. Well, that connection with my vocal group, we call ourselves Soirée Musicale Quintet. So 5 people, 4 of them sing, and I play the piano. And that's mainly 19th century music. And our first concerts, and including our most recent one, was held at the Old Government House,
Right.
which is part of QUT at Gardens Point. We've also given concerts at St Mary's Anglican Church, Kangaroo Point,
Yes.
at Somerville House, the Chambers, which was the original South Brisbane Municipal Chambers. And so we like to go to venues which have history embedded in them. And at the Old Government House, for instance, some years ago, we recreated a program that was as a birthday program for Edward VII.
Right.
A concert given in Brisbane, and we produced the whole program anew
Oh,
with
how
all the music. That was wonderful.
Oh, how wonderful. And I'm sure many of our listeners would love to hear you perform, but they'd also like to buy some of your books. So
Okay.
can you tell me, I know if you go online, just tell me your webpage again.
That would probably be the best way. www.peterroennfeldt, PeterRoennfeldt.com. And there's a contact inquiry page. Some books I can sell, others I can refer you to publishers.
Thank you, Professor Peter Roennfeldt, musician, historian, and presenter, for being my guest today.
Thank you.
Great friends and great chats. That was another Lots to Chat About with Rosemary Peterswald. Stay tuned next week for another amazing chat.